"Dad, they put our things in the basement," my daughter Emma whispered into the phone, her voice trembling with confusion and hurt. "Grandma said we don't deserve the nice rooms because Julie is more important." I was in the middle of a 12-hour shift at the hospital when I got that call that changed everything. My hands clenched the phone as I tried to process what I had just heard. "What do you mean basement, sweetheart?" I asked, already feeling anger rising in my throat. "They moved our beds, our clothes, everything. Grandpa said Uncle Stephen and Aunt Lisa need more room for Julie, so we have to stay down there now." "My name is Tyler, I'm 36 years old, and I'm a nurse at the Nashville Medical Center. After my divorce 2 years ago, my 10-year-old twins, Emma and Jake, and I moved in with my ex-in-laws as a temporary solution, while I saved up for a place of our own. Martha and Richard had always been complicated, but they offered their help when I needed it most. Working double shifts to support my kids on my own, I needed someone to pick them up from school and help with the basics. What I didn't expect was to find out that my own in-laws considered me a disposable burden. "Emma, listen carefully," I said quietly, checking to make sure no co-workers were listening. "You and Jake stay calm, okay? Dad will take care of this." But as I spoke reassuring words to my daughter, my mind was racing. It wasn't just about bedrooms or space. It was about respect. It was about my children being treated like second-class citizens in their own family. Jake had chronic asthma. The Richards' basement was damp, with visible mold on one of the walls and terrible ventilation. Putting my son down there wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. "Julie doesn't even live here," Emma continued, her voice getting louder. "She only comes on weekends, but now she has the nicest room in the whole house." Julie was the 3-year-old daughter of my brother-in-law Stephen and his wife Lisa. Since she was born, Martha and Richard had treated her like a little princess, while my children, who had lived there for almost 2 years, were constantly reminded that they were guests in the house. "Daddy will be home in a few hours," I promised. "Until then, you two stay together, okay?" I hung up the phone and stood in the hospital hallway, feeling a mixture of anger and determination I hadn't felt in years. The other nurses passed me, going about their routines, unaware of the war that had just been declared. Because that's exactly what happened in that moment. A war. They thought they could humiliate me through my children. They thought I had no choice, that I depended on them too much to fight back. They thought they could treat Emma and Jake like trash while spoiling their favorite granddaughter. They were wrong. What Martha and Richard didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 months planning our exit. Every extra shift I worked, every penny I saved, every sacrifice I made, it all had a purpose. I had already found our new home. I had already signed the lease. I had everything organized for us to move in 2 weeks. But that was before they crossed the line that should never have been crossed. Now, instead of a quiet, civilized exit, they were going to get something very different. If you're enjoying this story of how family hypocrisy can explode in the face of those who least expect it, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how this seemingly hopeless situation turned into the most expensive lesson my ex-in-laws ever learned. Because when I got home that night and saw my children sitting in the cold, damp basement, surrounded by their few possessions thrown into cardboard boxes, something inside me crystallized into a cold, calculated determination. They wanted to play the family favoritism game? Perfect. But they had no idea that I had spent the last 2 years studying every rule, every weakness, every dirty secret of this family. And now it was time to show them how to play to win. Martha and Richard had always treated Stephen like the golden child, but when Julie was born 3 years ago, the favoritism reached absurd levels. My ex-wife Sarah had died in a car accident when the twins were only 8, and her parents took me in temporarily after the divorce because, according to them, family helps family. What a blatant lie. Stephen worked in tech, made 6 figures a year, and lived in a mansion across town. But every time Julie visited her grandparents, they turned the house into a palace for their little princess. They bought a special $1,200 bed just for her visits. They installed extra security cameras because Julie needs to be protected. They even hired a private nanny for the weekends. Meanwhile, my kids slept in bunk beds bought at a thrift store and were constantly scolded for any noise they made. "Jake, stop coughing so loud, you'll wake Julie," Martha would say whenever my son had an asthma attack. As if he could control when his lungs decided to close up. The hypocrisy was so blatant it was comical. Julie could run around the house screaming at 6 in the morning, but if Emma wanted to practice the violin after school, it was too much noise for a respectable home. "Tyler, you need to teach your kids to be more considerate," Richard told me once, while Julie destroyed Martha's garden with a plastic trowel. Kids need to learn boundaries. Boundaries. Their favorite word when it came to Emma and Jake. Lisa, Stephen's wife, was even worse. She treated my house like a free daycare, showing up whenever she needed someone to watch Julie while she had important appointments. Her important appointments included spa sessions, lunches with friends, and shopping at expensive boutiques. "Oh, Tyler, you don't mind keeping an eye on Julie today, do you?" she would say, already pushing the child out the door. "I promise I'll be back in no time." No time meant 8 hours later, when she returned laden with shopping bags and freshly manicured nails. What irritated me most was how they treated my children like free domestic servants. Emma was constantly called upon to help Aunt Lisa with tasks that were not the responsibility of a 10-year-old. Jake was forced to carry Martha's heavy groceries, even with his respiratory problems. "It's good for them to learn responsibility," Martha would say when I questioned her. But Julie? Julie never needed to learn responsibility. Julie was a princess who deserved to be waited on by everyone around her. The last straw came last month, during Emma's birthday. My daughter had asked for a small party with a few school friends. Nothing fancy, just pizza, cake, and some games in the backyard. Martha thought it would be perfect to schedule the party on the same day as Julie's christening. "The kids can play together," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. "It'll be more fun that way." What she didn't mention was that she had invited 30 people to the christening, including a professional photographer, princess-themed decorations, and a 3-tier cake that cost more than I made in a week. Emma's birthday party became a sideshow to Julie's own celebration. Emma's friends were practically ignored by the adults, who were all busy admiring the 3-year-old's every move. When Emma blew out the candles on her simple chocolate cake, half the guests were busy taking pictures of Julie trying to eat a piece of the christening cake. I watched my daughter force a smile and politely thank everyone for a party that had been completely overshadowed by her cousin. That night, I found Emma crying in the bathroom. "Daddy, why doesn't Grandma like us?" she asked, her eyes red and swollen. I couldn't answer. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that her own grandparents consider her inferior to her cousin? How do you tell her that, in their twisted minds, she and her brother are just inconvenient obstacles standing in the way of the real favorite family? Jake was suffering even more. His grades began to slip at school, and his teacher called me in for a troubling conversation about changes in his behavior. "Jake seems anxious and distracted," Mr. Peterson explained. "He used to be one of the most outgoing students, but now he sits quietly in the corner and has trouble concentrating." At home, I saw my son tiptoeing around, trying to be invisible so he wouldn't bother anyone. He stopped telling me about the science projects he loved, because Martha always interrupted with some more important task related to Julie. The damp basement where they had moved my children smelled of mold that burned my nose as soon as I walked down the stairs. The walls were stained with moisture, and I could see small signs of seepage in one of the corners. For a child with asthma, this environment was potentially dangerous. But it wasn't just about health. It was about dignity. It was about Martha looking at my children and deciding that they didn't even deserve decent rooms in the house where they had lived for 2 years. As I walked through the cold basement, seeing my children's few possessions thrown into boxes like disposable trash, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Because Martha, Richard, Stephen, and Lisa had made a fundamental mistake. They assumed I was just a desperate divorced nurse dependent on their charity to survive. They assumed I had no options, no resources, no intelligence to defend myself. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 18 months meticulously documenting every incident of favoritism, every cruel comment, every moment of neglect toward my children. Not out of paranoia, but out of precaution. And what they definitely didn't know was that my dependence on their help was about to reveal itself as the most strategic preparation of my life. While they were building their little dynasty of family favoritism, I was quietly building our escape. And when the time came for the reveal, it would be devastating. Because the truth about Martha and Richard was about to explode in their faces in a way they could never predict or control. The morning after the room reshuffle, Jake had his first asthma attack in 6 months. The damp, moldy air in the basement had attacked his lungs during the night, and I found him sitting on the edge of his bed at 5 in the morning, struggling to breathe. "Dad, I can't," he whispered between gasps, clutching his inhaler with trembling hands. I carried my son upstairs, where the air was cleaner, and called the hospital to let them know I'd be late. While Jake recovered on the living room couch, Martha came downstairs in her pink silk robe, visibly annoyed by the early morning noise. "Tyler, you need to teach that boy how to use the inhaler lower," she complained, making coffee as if her grandson's breathing crisis were nothing more than a nuisance. "Julie's still sleeping." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, something more dangerous. A deadly calm I recognized from my worst shifts at the hospital, when I had to make critical decisions without letting my emotions get in the way. "Jake has chronic asthma, Martha," I replied in a controlled voice. "The basement is exacerbating his condition." "Kids need to adapt." Richard appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for work. "In my day, there was no such thing as asthma. It built character." Built character. My 10-year-old son struggling to breathe built character. I drove Jake to school myself that day and took the opportunity to talk to the school nurse about the change in his breathing. Sarah Peterson, a kind woman who had known my children for 2 years, was concerned. "Tyler, Jake seems different lately," she confided as we updated his emergency medical plan. "More withdrawn, anxious. And now this worsening asthma. Is something going on at home?" "We're going through some family changes," I replied carefully. "But I'm taking care of it." What Sarah didn't know was that taking care of it meant I had spent the entire night on the phone with lawyers, real estate agents, and my accountant. Moving my kids into the basement hadn't just been an insult, it had been the catalyst I needed to accelerate plans that had been in the works for months. That afternoon, when I got home from work, I found Emma crying in the hall bathroom. Her tears weren't from a tantrum or childish frustration, but from a deep sadness that no 10-year-old should have to carry. "What happened, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling down beside her. "Grandma said I can't play the violin after 5 o'clock anymore because the noise bothers Julie when she comes to visit," Emma sobbed. "But 5 is the only time I can practice after school and homework." My daughter had won a partial scholarship for violin lessons after impressing her teacher with her natural talent. It was her passion, her escape, her source of self-esteem. And Martha was destroying that to accommodate a child who didn't even live in the house. "And there's more, Dad," Emma continued, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Aunt Lisa said that since we're living here for free, Jake and I should help out more with Julie when she visits. Like we're babysitters. For free. As if I hadn't been paying a significant portion of the household bills for the past 2 years. As if I wasn't the one who fixed the leaky faucet, mowed the lawn, cooked for the whole family on weekends. You know what hurts me the most?" Emma whispered, looking me in the eyes with a disturbing maturity. "It's that they act like we don't deserve to be here. Like Julie is more important because she has rich parents." At that moment, looking at my daughter's bruised face, something fundamental crystallized inside me. It was no longer about quietly leaving the house. It was about justice. It was about showing Martha, Richard, Stephen, and Lisa that underestimating Tyler Morrison had been the biggest mistake of their lives. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in their new rooms in the basement, I went upstairs to have a final conversation with my former in-laws. I found them in the living room watching television, comfortably settled in their leather armchairs like kings surveying their domain. "We need to talk about the kids," I began calmly. "If it's about Emma's violin, we've already decided," Martha said without even looking at me. "She can practice in the basement if she wants. The sound doesn't carry as much down there. The basement isn't properly soundproofed, and Jake is having asthma attacks because of the humidity," I explained, keeping my voice level. Richard sighed dramatically. "Tyler, you've always been overly protective of these children. A little adversity is good for them." Adversity. They called putting an asthmatic child in an environment that assaulted his lungs adversity. "Maybe it's time we considered other living arrangements," I said, testing their reactions. It was like I'd thrown a bomb in the middle of the room. Martha finally turned to face me, her eyes flashing with something between panic and indignation. "Other options," she repeated. "Tyler, you don't have other options. Where else are you going to get help with the kids? Who else is going to give you a place to live while you get your finances in order?" "You're being dramatic again," Richard added dismissively. "A few adjustments around the house don't warrant this overreaction." They were so certain of my desperation, of my dependence, that they couldn't even conceive of the possibility that I had alternatives. To them, I was a broken man, emotionally and financially destroyed by divorce, grateful for any crumbs of help they would throw my way. "You're right," I replied finally, forcing a tired smile. Sorry for the drama. It's just been hard adjusting to all these changes. The relief on their faces was almost comical. They had put me back in the dependent, problematic son-in-law box where I belonged in their twisted minds. I'm glad you understand, Tyler, Martha said condescendingly. Family means making sacrifices for each other. And right now, Stephen and Lisa need more support. Sacrifices. It was always my children who had to make sacrifices. I went down to the basement that night and found Jake and Emma huddled together in the darkness, whispering about how to make themselves invisible so they wouldn't bother anyone. My children were developing survival strategies in their own home. I sat down on Jake's bed and hugged them both. Listen to me carefully, I whispered. You are the most important people in my life. You deserve respect, love, and a home where you can grow up without fear. And I promise I will make sure you have that. But how, Dad? Emma asked with the cruel pragmatism of children who grow up too fast. Grandma and Grandpa don't really want us here. I smiled in the dark, a smile they couldn't see but that carried all the determination that had built up during months of quiet planning. Let Daddy worry about that, I replied. Just trust me a little longer. What they didn't know was that a little longer meant exactly 72 hours. In 72 hours, Martha and Richard would discover that all the security and control they thought they had over our situation had been a carefully maintained illusion. While they slept peacefully in their comfortable beds, I was finalizing the last details of a plan that would not only free us from this house, but show the entire family the true cost of humiliating the wrong people. Because Martha and Richard were about to learn a lesson that took them a lifetime to deserve. And when the storm hit, they wouldn't even have time to look for shelter. The morning after our reconciliation talk, I began implementing plans that had been carefully laid out over the past 8 months. While Martha and Richard believed they had brought me back into line, I was finalizing the transfer of all my assets to the new bank account I had opened in my name and my children's names. What they didn't know was that my apparent financial dependence was an illusion I had meticulously cultivated. Every penny I contributed to household expenses actually came from a separate account I kept specifically for that purpose. My actual salary as a specialized nurse, plus the extra shifts and private consulting work I did on weekends, had allowed me to live comfortably for a long time. The house I had found was not a recent discovery. It was a property I had been watching for 6 months, located in a quiet residential neighborhood just 15 minutes from the hospital. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a fenced-in backyard, and most importantly, a state-of-the-art air filtration system to ensure that Jake would never again have asthma attacks due to poor air quality. I had signed the lease 3 weeks before the forced move to the basement. The move was scheduled for next Saturday. During my lunch break, I called Sarah Peterson, my children's school nurse, for a conversation I had been planning for weeks. Sarah, I need to talk to you about a delicate situation involving my children, I began, choosing my words carefully. Sure, Tyler. I've noticed that both Emma and Jake seem different lately. More withdrawn. They are living in inadequate conditions in the house where we are temporarily staying. Jake has been moved to a damp basement that is severely aggravating his asthma. I would like you to officially document the changes in his condition. Sarah had known my children for 2 years and trusted my professional judgment. As a fellow healthcare professional, she immediately understood the legal implications of what I was requesting. I'll prepare a detailed medical report on Jake's respiratory status and the behavioral changes I've observed in both children, she confirmed. These records could be important if you need official documentation. Official documentation. Just what I needed. That afternoon, I found Lisa in the kitchen preparing Julie's bottle with special filtered water Martha had purchased exclusively for her favorite granddaughter. The irony was that my children had been drinking tap water for 2 years. Tyler, I'm so glad I found you, Lisa said in that condescending tone she had perfected. Stephen and I were talking about how Emma and Jake could help out more with Julie during visits. They're at the perfect age to learn responsibility. What kind of help do you have in mind? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Simple things. Emma could help with Julie's meals, and Jake could carry the equipment when we arrive. Nothing too much, just small tasks that show they understand the privilege of having a little cousin. Privilege. As if my kids should feel honored to be treated like child servants. I'm sure they'll be happy to help, I replied, knowing it would be the last time Lisa would make such a request. As Lisa continued to detail how my children could best serve her family's needs, I discreetly recorded our conversation on my phone. Not out of paranoia, but because I had learned to document anything that might be relevant later. Stephen came home that night with an even more arrogant attitude than usual. During dinner, he proudly announced that he had received a significant promotion at work. "I'm finally getting what I deserve," he said, cutting his steak like a king in his castle. "Lisa and I are thinking about expanding the house. Maybe add a whole wing for when Julie grows up." "How wonderful, dear," Martha practically beamed with pride. "You were always destined for success." While the family celebrated Stephen's achievements, Emma and Jake ate silently in the corner of the table, like ghosts in their own home. No one asked about their day at school. No one noticed that Jake had been coughing throughout the meal because of the dampness in the basement. "Tyler," Richard addressed me like a feudal lord speaking to a servant, "we hope you understand the importance of setting a good example for the children. Stephen worked hard for this promotion. It's important that Emma and Jake see the value of dedicated effort." The value of dedicated effort. As if I didn't work 12-hour shifts saving children's lives, while Stephen pushed buttons in an air-conditioned office. "Absolutely," I agreed with a smile. "Children definitely need to understand how the real world works." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went down to the basement to check on my kids. I found them awake, whispering, planning how to behave the next day so as not to upset anyone. "Dad," Jake asked me as I sat down on the edge of his bed, "why do Grandma and Grandpa like Julie better than us?" The question broke my heart, but it also crystallized my final determination. "Sometimes people have wrong ideas about what's important," I replied carefully. "But that has nothing to do with you. You are extraordinary, and anyone lucky enough to have you in their life should treat you like the treasures you are." "But we're going to have to stay here forever?" Emma asked, her voice laden with a resignation no 10-year-old should feel. I smiled in the dark, a smile laden with all the secret plans I had been developing. "No, sweetheart. Definitely not forever." What my children didn't know was that our move was scheduled to happen in less than 72 hours. What Martha, Richard, Stephen, and Lisa didn't know was that their comfortable family dynamic was about to implode in a way they could never have predicted or controlled. If you've been following this story and wondering how anyone could plan such a meticulous exit while appearing to be completely defenseless, subscribe to the channel because the execution of this plan will show that underestimating the intelligence of a protective father is the most expensive mistake a family can make. Because on Friday morning, as I served breakfast to the family I thought had completely tamed me, I received a phone call that would set in motion events that would change their lives forever. The person on the other end of the line said just 5 words that sealed the fate of all of us. "Tyler, we have everything we need." The call was from the private investigator I had hired 3 months earlier. Michael Rodriguez had 20 years of experience digging up corporate secrets, and what he had uncovered about Stephen and his company was far more sordid than I could ever have imagined. "The wire transfers are all documented," Michael explained as we reviewed the files in my new home, which was completely furnished and ready to welcome my children. "Stephen has been embezzling funds from investors for 2 years. Over $400,000 in offshore accounts." But that was just the beginning. Richard, my respected former father-in-law who worked in the city's licensing department, had been illegally approving construction projects in exchange for kickbacks. The scheme involved Stephen providing the tech contacts, while Richard facilitated the bureaucratic approvals. "The new house they're building," Michael continued, showing photos and documents. "Financed entirely with dirty money. And Martha knew all about it. She signs as a witness on several fraudulent contracts." That Friday morning, as I was preparing breakfast as usual, my phone rang again. It was Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI. "Mr. Morrison, we need you to maintain your normal routine today. Our operation begins at 2 p.m. You and your children must be off the property by 1:30. "Perfect." My children would be out of school at 2:15, plenty of time to pick them up and take them directly to our new home, far away from what was about to happen. During breakfast, Stephen was particularly arrogant, bragging about a new $1 million contract he had closed. What he didn't know was that this particular contract had been obtained through inside information that Richard had illegally provided, and that was now completely documented by the FBI. "Tyler," Stephen said condescendingly as he cut his bacon, "maybe it's time you started thinking about contributing more financially to this household. Martha and Dad can't support you guys forever. Contribute more." I had been paying almost half the household bills for 2 years. You're right, I replied calmly. I've been thinking a lot about our financial situation lately. Around 11 in the morning, I pretended to leave for work as usual, but instead I drove to my kids' school. I explained to the secretary that we had a family medical emergency and I needed to pick them up early. Emma and Jake met me in the parking lot, worried by my serious expression. Dad, what's going on? Emma asked as she put her backpack in the back seat. Remember when I promised you that our situation was going to change? I asked, driving toward our new neighborhood. Well, the change started today. We arrived at our new home at 2 o'clock sharp. A house they didn't know existed, completely furnished and decorated over the last 3 days by a team I had hired discreetly. Dad, whose house is this? Jake asked, wide-eyed, as we walked through the entrance. Wow, I replied simply. Welcome to our new home. As my children explored in wonder the rooms that had been designed specifically for them, rooms with air filters for Jake's asthma, soundproofing for Emma's violin, my phone buzzed with a message from Agent Walsh. Operation underway. Warrants executed. 20 minutes later, my phone exploded with calls. First Martha, then Richard, then Stephen. I didn't answer any of them. Finally, Martha managed to leave a voicemail that revealed exactly the panic that was happening in that house. Tyler, where the hell are you? The FBI is here with search warrants. They're taking all the computers, documents, everything. They said someone provided information about illegal activities. You need to get home now. Home. Interesting how it was home now that they needed me. The second message came from Stephen, and his voice no longer carried its usual arrogance. Tyler, call me now. My lawyer said someone turned in detailed evidence about operations that shouldn't even exist. Who the hell would have access to that kind of information? The third message was from Richard, and for the first time in 2 years, his voice sounded pleading. Tyler, son, I know we've had our differences, but family helps family, right? I need to know if you've seen anything strange in the house, if anyone has had access to our documents. Around 4 in the afternoon, while helping Emma arrange her books on her new bookshelf in her bedroom, I got the call I had been waiting for. It was Lisa, hysterical. Tyler, where are you? She screamed into the phone. Stephen's joint account has been frozen. Our credit cards have been cancelled. They took our car. They said it's the product of criminal activity. I'm sorry to hear that, Lisa, I replied calmly. Where are the boys? They're safe, I replied, watching Jake happily assemble his new desk. Somewhere where they're valued and respected. What does that mean? Lisa screamed. It means we're no longer your problem, I replied. Just like you always wanted. That's when Martha took the phone from Lisa's hands. Tyler Morrison, you get back here right now. Her voice carried all the authority she was used to exercising over me. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this family does not tolerate disloyalty. Disloyalty. The woman who had moved my children into a moldy basement was talking about disloyalty. Martha, I replied with a calmness that made her stop shouting. For 2 years, you treated me like a burden and my children like second-class citizens. You thought I had no options, no resources, and no intelligence to fight back. Tyler, you don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly, I interrupted her. I understand that Richard accepted over $80,000 in kickbacks over the last 18 months. I understand that Stephen embezzled funds from investors to finance your extravagant lifestyle. And I understand that you, Martha, signed documents knowing exactly where the money came from. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Where did you get this information? She whispered. You've forgotten that I work in a hospital with forensic accountants, insurance investigators, and lawyers who specialize in financial crimes, I explained patiently. People who noticed some interesting inconsistencies when I started asking the right questions. In fact, it was even simpler than that. Since I had access to the computers in the house for 2 years, I had discreetly copied documents I shouldn't have seen. Documents that Stephen left open while he worked, bills that Richard received by email, conversations I overheard through the thin walls of the house. The irony was delicious. They had treated me like a piece of furniture for so long that they forgot furniture has eyes and ears. Tyler, Martha's voice was shaking now, we can talk about this. We are family. We can work this out internally. Family, I repeated. Family doesn't move children into unsanitary basements. Family doesn't constantly humiliate their own grandchildren. And family definitely doesn't use stolen money to finance whims while pretending to be morally superior. That's when Stephen took the phone, his voice heavy with a desperate anger that I recognized as fear in disguise. You don't know who you're messing with, Tyler. I can destroy your career, your reputation, your entire life. I laughed softly. Stephen, your company is under investigation for federal fraud. Your accounts are frozen. Your father is about to be indicted for corruption. And you think you can threaten me? What they didn't know was that there was one last bomb left to explode. A bomb that would turn this federal investigation into a scandal that would dominate the local headlines for months. And at 5 o'clock that afternoon, when the news cameras arrived at the door of the house where I had been humiliated for so long, that bomb would finally explode. The fifth bomb exploded at 5 o'clock when the television cameras arrived. Not by accident, I had provided information to 3 investigative journalists about the exact timing of the federal operation. What turned a simple search warrant into a national scandal was the discovery that Richard had forged adoption documents to facilitate child trafficking schemes through his position at City Hall. Stephen wasn't just a financial fraudster, he was the tech expert who created digital systems to erase traces of missing children. The cameras captured Martha being handcuffed at the front door, screaming about how those ungrateful boys had destroyed the family. The irony was delicious. She still didn't understand that her own ungrateful boys were safe in their new home, watching cartoons and eating pizza. The most satisfying moment was when Martha was asked by reporters why she had put children at risk, and her response was, they should be grateful to have a roof over their heads. That phrase went viral on social media. #GratisPoloTeto became a national meme, symbolizing the hypocrisy of people who use charity as an excuse for abuse. Stephen was arrested in his office during a meeting with Japanese investors, who had flown specifically to Nashville to close a $20 million deal. Images of him being escorted in handcuffs through the halls of the company he built with dirty money circulated on social media for weeks. The most devastating detail was discovering that Stephen had used the identities of missing children to create fake offshore bank accounts. When investigators traced the funds, they found connections to international human trafficking rings. Richard tried to escape through the basement when he saw the cameras, but was intercepted by federal agents just as he was trying to burn documents in the barbecue grill. The ashes of the partially burned papers contained enough fragments to reconstruct evidence of bribery dating back a decade. At 62, Richard faced 15 federal charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. During the trial, it was revealed that he had pocketed more than $500,000 in bribes, money he used to finance Stephen's extravagances and Martha's whims. Lisa discovered that her personal bank account had also been frozen when she tried to buy gas and her card was declined. The luxury car she drove was registered to one of Stephen's shell companies, so it was confiscated by the feds. She called her mother in tears, begging to move back in with her parents until things got sorted out. But Lisa's parents, upon learning from the news that she had known about the family's crimes and never reported them, refused to help her. Lisa's final humiliation came when she had to take the bus to court, carrying Julie in her arms because she couldn't afford a babysitter. The same woman who had once treated my children like servants was now struggling to pay for diapers. Things never worked out for any of them. Richard was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Stephen received 30 years for racketeering and crimes against children. Martha, as an accomplice, got 15 years, but her advanced age and health problems meant she would likely die in prison. Stephen's company went completely bankrupt when investors discovered that 60% of his innovative products were pirated technologies from smaller startups that he had deliberately sabotaged. 6 months later, I was promoting Emma and Jake to their new beds in our permanent home, a 4-bedroom property I bought with the money from selling exclusive information to documentary filmmakers about organized crime. My experience as a key witness earned me lucrative contracts with 3 television networks. The documentary Family Predators won an Emmy for Best Investigative Reporting. During the award ceremony, they dedicated a special segment to how courageous whistleblowers help expose systemic corruption. Jake hasn't had an asthma attack since. The air filtration system in the new house is so effective that he was able to run a full mile without stopping for the first time in years. Emma became first violinist in the City Youth Orchestra, and her teacher commented that she had never seen a child with such natural talent and discipline. Most importantly, They grew up knowing that their father had fought for them when no one else would. They learned that standing up for yourself isn't revenge, it's self-respect. Sarah Peterson, the school nurse, became a close friend of the family. She often commented on the dramatic transformation she saw in both children. Tyler, she told me during one of Emma's violin recitals, I've never seen children recover so completely from family trauma. They didn't just survive, they flourished. My supervisor at the hospital, Dr. Martinez, also noticed changes in my work. The confidence I gained from confronting my dysfunctional family translated into natural leadership on the medical team. You're different, Tyler, he observed during my annual evaluation. More assertive, more confident. I'm promoting you to night shift supervisor. The promotion came with a 20% raise, which allowed me to set up college funds for Emma and Jake. Never again would they be dependent on the generosity of toxic relatives. Dad, Emma asked me as she hung her music medals on her bedroom wall, did you always know it would work out like this? Not exactly like this, I replied honestly. But I always knew that people who mistreat defenseless children eventually pay the price. I just helped the universe speed up the process. Jake, now 13, had become a confident and articulate young man. During a family dinner, he made an observation that surprised me with its maturity. Dad, I think the saddest part isn't that they got arrested, but that they never understood why they were wrong. To this day, they probably think they were wronged. He was right. During the trial, none of the three showed genuine remorse. Martha continued to insist she had been misunderstood. Stephen blamed biased investigators. Richard claimed he was just trying to help the family. The Morrison family's legacy was not Richard's life in prison, Stephen's bankruptcy, or Lisa's humiliating divorce. It was the lesson my children learned: never accept being treated like a second-class citizen by anyone, even family. Especially family. The real revenge wasn't destroying his lives. It was building such extraordinary lives for my children that the toxicity of that home became just a distant memory of a dark period that made them stronger. 3 years later, Martha wrote me from prison asking for forgiveness and begging to see her grandchildren just once. The letter arrived the same day Jake won first place at the state science fair and Emma was accepted into the advanced music program at the local university. I threw the letter in the trash unopened. Some bridges, when burned by toxicity, must remain ashes. What I learned during those years of rebuilding is that protecting your children sometimes means cutting ties with people who share their DNA. True family isn't determined by genetics, but by love, respect, and unconditional support. Today our family includes Sarah Peterson, Dr. Martinez, Nancy from work, and a dozen other people who have chosen to be there during important moments. Emma and Jake have adoptive grandparents who love them genuinely, not conditionally. Last week, I stumbled across an article about rehabilitation programs in federal prisons. Martha had signed up for group therapy for family reconciliation. Part of me felt a twinge of something, not exactly pity, but a sadness for the person she could have been if she had chosen love over favoritism. But then Jake called me over to see his new robotics project, and Emma started playing a new piece on her violin, and I remembered that some stories have happy endings precisely because others end definitively. If this story of how one father's determination can turn the tables on an entire family of narcissists touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of people who refused to accept injustice and turned humiliation into victory. Stories of courage, strategy, and poetic justice that prove that manipulators always underestimate their victims. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming so extraordinarily successful that they become irrelevant. And when your children ask you how you manage to protect them from people who should have loved them unconditionally, you can look them in the eye and say with pride, because you deserve to be happy. And I will never stop fighting for that happiness.